Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema Podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle. Thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com, as well as the Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube channel. You can also subscribe to patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. There you'll get early access to reviews for movies such as the ones that we are going to be talking about this episode. Brief overviews of older movies that I'm watching for the first time, which I started earlier this year and plan on continuing, as well as if you go further up on the subscription amount, you can also get deep dives like the one that I am currently working on for this month when it comes to the directorial career of Clive Barker. That is patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. So last year I did a Class of 1999 series where I looked at some of the most noteworthy films and some of the not so noteworthy films of the 1999 movie year, which is a year that I hold near and dear to my heart. And this year we're going to look at some parts of the 2000 movie year, but not necessarily on the same level as I did with 1999, as it's all going to be focused on a particular genre, and that genre is horror. And we're going to center in on a few movies tonight, but we're also going to talk about the genre in general for that year, and join me to do so is the creator of Death Ensemble, the website. He's been on here before, and I swear we'll be talking about new good movies at some point during our time together. Please welcome back to the show, Phil Fasso. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. And Brian, if we switch to good movies at some point, I'm going to be really confused. Because when I come on, it seems to be we are the kings of trash, and we will discuss only garbage.
Well, I mean, you certainly picked. There were certainly some choices that you brought up when we talked about this last year. I mean, maybe it's just the fact that we were talking about The Rage, Carrie 2, and End of Days together that made you choose the movies that we're talking about. There is one genuinely good movie that we will be talking about that was sort of a last-minute addition to this, but I'm looking forward to
this. Yes, we get a chance to redeem ourselves, which is odd for you and me when we have this conversation.
Yeah. I am looking forward to this discussion, though, because of the fact that 2000, honestly, like the year 2000 in general, there are some great movies that came out that year. On the whole, though, it's definitely not one of my favorite movie years. It's a relatively weak one, especially compared to something like 1999 or 2001. And horror was certainly no different. Let's put it this way: when arguably the best horror movie. Well, okay, there are two ways I could go with this. Arguably, the best movie released for the first time in 2000 that was somewhat horror was Requiem for a Dream, which is not strictly speaking a horror movie.
Sure.
The best horror movie that came out in the year 2000 was arguably the new cut of The Exorcist that came out that year, which include the Spider Walk and some other stuff, and basically stuff that doesn't hold up compared to the original version of The Exorcist.
It's just like I was looking up. I checked out a list of, when we first discussed getting together to do this a couple weeks ago, I just pulled up a list. And the horror movies that came out that year are all over the place.
Yeah.
So you have, Ginger Snaps, which is a very low budget, I believe, Canadian flick. Basically about, using turning into a werewolf as a metaphor for coming of age for a woman, right?
Yeah.
So that's very low budget, very cheap, very, made on the fly. And then on the other end of things, you have What Lies Beneath with Harrison Ford and Michelle Pfeiffer.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're all over the place here, you know? I mean, Dracula 3000 or Dracula 2000, I'm sorry, came out that year. Yeah. Awful. I saw that in the theaters and regret that. I mean, one of my guilty pleasures is Blair Witch 2, Book of Shadows, which I saw in the movies and hated.
Yeah.
I mean, I like the first one. I don't like it so much anymore, but, you know, I'm like, what the hell did they do? And then a couple of years ago, a year or two ago, I watched it again, and I'm like, wow, this is hysterical. Why didn't I have some campy fun with this when I was in the theater? And that poor director, who's very famous for directing the
Paradise.
What are the names? Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, he got roped into that, and there's a whole story about he didn't get to make the movie that he wanted. But besides that, you know, that is a guilty pleasure of mine, because that movie was just, if you look at it as a horror comedy, it's incredible. As a straight-up horror movie, which it was supposed to be, it's fucking awful.
Yeah.
You know, and then what really interests me about this whole thing is that Scream was what, 96, 97?
96.
96.
Yeah.
So we're only 4 years out from there. And basically in this whole line of movies, you know, you could tell that over 4 years, the geography of horror had changed, because you only have two movies that are that whole meta, that whole self-reflective, you know, self-aware thing. Yeah. You have Urban Legend's Final Cut, which is, again, awful. I mean, I like the first one. The first one was, you know, dumb fun. But you have that, and then you have Wes Craven putting on what will be the cap on that series for a long time with Scream 3.
Yeah.
But even you could tell after that, was stepping away from it, because it seemed that whole thing with the self-aware Kevin Williamson scripts came and kind of went very quickly, didn't it?
Oh, yeah, it did. I mean, you know, it's funny because of the fact that, like, the sort of teen horror that was so jam-packed with actors that came out of Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer, it basically morphed into teen comedies coming out with American Pie and all of that for a few years. And then, yeah, it basically, like in 2001, 2002, it basically just died off. And yeah, I mean, you're right. Like and it's the 90s when it comes to horror. I mean, we're talking about the year 2000, but the 90s when it comes to horror is very weird because, you know, in the 80s you had, it was basically the heyday of the slasher film. The 90s, there's not really a set identity. Like there
really isn't. And looking at 2000, that goes into the year that we're talking about now, because like I said, these movies are all over the place.
Yeah.
There's no like defining theme between. I'm looking at 30 different, you know, posters on my computer screen right now, and it's just all over the place. There's no common theme, you know?
Yeah.
Like 70s, you had the religious horror, and you had the Giallos and all that. 80s, like you said, was slashers. By the time you hit the 90s, I mean, the thing was, you know, that the early 90s, they were still trying to carry out stuff like, you know, Jason Goes to Hell and those type of things, and nobody cared anymore. You know, that was said and done pretty much.
Yeah.
So it looks like the whole subgenre, the whole genre of horror is just looking for some kind of direction, and it's grasping all over the place. Mm-hmm. And the one that really sticks out to me is What Lies Beneath, because like I said, Harrison Ford, and I tried watching it. I liked it when it first came out. My ex-wife and I watched it on DVD. We had a fun time with it. I tried watching it recently, and like the first 20 minutes are about him and his wife, and he's taking his daughter to college and all that. And it's very like set up. But I'm like, wow, this movie's like 2 hours long, and it doesn't need to be. You know, so I couldn't even. I should have gone through with it, because once it gets kicking, it's a really good movie. But it's one of those movies that's too long. It's just interesting that Harrison Ford is technically in what would be called a horror movie at that point.
Well,
you know,
well, and it's directed by Robert Zemeckis. I mean, that's
yes,
movie,
it is.
That's the movie he made while he was weighing on Tom Hanks to
Castaway, right?
Transformation for Castaway, and it was. And I haven't seen it since 2000. I wasn't that big a fan of it at that time. And I don't know. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe I just wasn't necessarily in the mood for it. Because that summer, it just in general was not really a good summer for me. But no, there, you know, yeah. And the thing is, it's like you do sort of see, in a way, after Sixth Sense, you sort of start to see a sort of leaning towards the more supernatural aspects of horror, because in 2001 you have the Others, which was a fairly big hit, and then you start to see more along these lines of supernatural horror until Paranormal Activity, which really kind of ushers in the found footage era.
Well, you also have to remember that right now we are at 2000. We're only about 3 or 4 years off from Saw. Yeah. So you went in the whole torture porn, which is, I don't want to get started on what garbage that is. I don't enjoy watching people tied down to chairs with their fingernails being ripped off for 90 minutes. But that whole thing too, like the time, it was funny because that whole thing, like Saw came out in 2007, or 2004, I believe, and then there was a sequel. 2004, and then it was a sequel a year until Paranormal Activity came out, and then that was the whole thing. So it just seems like the horror genre, like you said, you had a whole decade in the 80s where it was basically slashers. I mean, you had other stuff in there, but that was the dominant type of movie, you know? Whereas here it seems like horror's been looking to grasp onto something for a while, and it stays a little bit with Scream and that type of movie, the self-aware stuff. It's torture porn for a while. It's found footage. And the funny thing is that none of these just really, it seems like one, and again, it's what I call the Friends philosophy. Like, I remember when the show Friends came out, I hate that show. Believe me, I would not. I'd rather be victim to some of the horrors in some of these movies and watch a fucking episode of that. But the thing is, once Friends came out, all of a sudden you had a whole bunch of TV series the next couple of years come out where, it's 6 friends or 4 friends or whatever, and they live in an urban city somewhere, and they all meet at a coffee shop, you know?
Yeah.
So, I mean, horror obviously has been very trendy since the very beginning, pretty much. Mm-hmm. You know, and the thing is that it just astounds me that it's been so long where we haven't had like a full decade where anything caught on and just ran with it, you know?
Yeah.
Where you could look at I mean, I don't care if you're looking at if you're looking at the 2009 version of Friday the 13th, you could still look at that and see the footprint in the 80s, you know?
Yeah. No,
and that was, you know, I like that. I like that, especially because I was growing up in the 80s. And that was, you know, my parents got their first VCR in 82 or 83, you know? Mm-hmm. And it was like that whole thing of going to the video store. My mom's going to rent this horror movies because it's Halloween or it's a Saturday night. Yeah, well, that was a lot of fun back then. I have fond memories, even if the movies are mostly garbage. I have fond memories of watching them, you know?
Right. No,
so,
it's just really like you said. I mean, the year in horror and the genre in general was just kind of all over the place, and I think we're going to show that in the 4 main films that we're going to be talking about tonight. And to start, let's go ahead and start with the one that most definitively set up a franchise in Final Destination.
Sure.
And I think that's probably a good place to start. It's the one that's most definitively a horror movie. The other ones kind of switch genres up on you, which is fine, and we'll get into those aspects of it. And so Final Destination basically starts with a teenager who's going on a class trip to Paris or France, and his classmates and he get on the airplane, and he has a vision of the plane crashing, and he has a freak out on the plane, and he gets thrown off along with some of the other students, in addition to a couple of the advisors, and they are off in the at the terminal, and the plane crashes. So they've averted death. Well, needless to say, Death is not too happy about that, and the rest of the movie is basically Death taking revenge on the people that it was robbed of in the plane crash. That right there,
yes.
what I basically just described is a slasher film. And I think that's one of the things that is kind of interesting about Final Destination and the sequels that that inspired is the fact that it's a bit of a different take on the slasher film than we're accustomed to. And I think that, and I'm not a huge fan of many of the sequels in general, and I mean, we can talk about that for a little bit.
Oh, we are definitely going to talk about the character names in the fourth one. We'll get to that later.
But this one is a really well put together slasher. The plane crash dream is very good. The idea that you have predestination here, survivor's guilt as part of the themes in this movie, as well as some fairly imaginative kills. Overall, it's a solid movie. It's an okay movie. I will admit, I feel rewatching it this month to talk about here, I don't like it quite as much as I did, and that's actually a common theme in some of the movies that we're talking about tonight as well, is where I'm not as big a fan of it as I was back in the day when I first saw it. So yeah, those are kind of my initial thoughts on Final Destination.
Well, I mean, here's my initial thoughts. Okay, first off, I think that what really hooks me in at the beginning is the whole. How many times? I don't know how many times you've flown. I got on a plane a couple weeks ago, and I don't have any problem with flying, right? Mm-hmm. But I got a friend who I've traveled with before, and he needs to be drugged down and he can't get on the plane. I literally stood behind him on line to get on a Southwest flight one time, and he was like tremoring. He was like shaking, and it was tremors going through his system.
Yeah.
Right? So I like how the whole beginning ties into that.
Yeah.
Like, obviously fear of death is a common primal thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But fear of death on a plane amplifies things because, hey, you get in a car accident, but even if the car flips over, your odds are you're going to end up on the ground, right? If you're in the 30,000 feet in the air and your plane blows up or a wing falls off, you are basically dead. There's no coming back from that, pretty much. So I think that it does a really good job of that, of keying into that primal fear of flying, right? Like, we're not supposed to be in the air naturally. We don't have wings, you know? Mm-hmm. So basically, it's a very, once we're up in the air, even if we don't mind flying like me, we're out of our element, you know?
Right.
And there's a real potential every time anyone gets on a plane that they might die. Now, you could say that about walking across the street, but it's a little different when you're 30,000 feet in the air, you know?
Yeah.
So I thought that was good. I thought the way they set it up with them coming off the plane and then the plane blowing up in the background, I thought, oh, that was really well done.
Mm-hmm.
You know? And then I thought that a big part of it is in order to enjoy that movie on a real level, and I'm not talking about just fucking heads flying off, people getting hit by buses and decapitated by trains and shit.
Yeah.
If you want to enjoy that movie on a real level, like enjoy it for filmmaking, you have to buy into the character, which is Devon Sawa's character, right? Because he's our lead. Do you remember his name in that movie?
I do not, as a matter of fact.
We'll get to naming in there in a little bit too. This series of movies has a weird fascination with how it names its characters.
Yeah.
But the thing is, if I'm not buying into his performance, I thought, I've seen Devon Sawa and some other stuff. He's a fairly good actor, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, he ended up being most famous probably for Friday. I think he was in Idle Hands, too. I'm pretty sure he's the lead in Idle Hands. So he ended up being pretty much known for some genre films. But, I mean, he gives a real performance, you know? Right. Not so much with some of the other actors, I've never really liked Ali Larter, and this is the first thing I ever saw her in because she's just flat in a lot of stuff,
Yeah.
She's just not very, she's supposed to play, like she's supposed to play like the quiet book nerd type girl, the bookworm girl,
mm-hmm.
and I'm not really buying her in that role at all.
Yeah.
She doesn't pull it off. Like, you see a little copy of some poetry. I hate when they do this in filmmaking. Like, it's such surface level crap. Like, she's reading a poetry book while she's waiting to get online on the point. So she's reserved, quiet, she's female, and she's reading a poetry book. Ooh, she must be deep, you know? So I get the whole thing. Like, I wouldn't really call this a slasher. And here's why. I think for a slasher, you need to have, like, I don't even consider the Friday, like, my friend Mike keep me into this, that the Freddy flicks, the Nightmare on Elm Street flicks aren't really slashers because they don't really mold to the concept, the trope so much. But anyway, I wouldn't really call this a slasher because this is really more like a Rube Goldberg type film, and this is just the start of a lot of Rube Goldberg devices in the series, right?
Yeah, that is an excellent point. Yeah.
Yes, because it seems like, and see, we'll talk about the sequels in a little bit, but as far as this movie goes, it's pretty tight. It's not like, and there's some decent tense scenes, like when I think they stop, like, Kerr, I forget the actor's name, the guy who used to, whatever, regardless, the one friend who's kind of cocky and kind of an asshole who got stuck with his crew, you know, he pulls the car onto the tracks, and Devin Sawa was stuck with him. And
the train sequence is really good. Like, the train...
Yeah, because it's tense.
Yeah, the train sequence is arguably my favorite of the quote-unquote revenge deaths in this entire in this entire movie, and maybe one of my favorites in the entire series. I mean, it occurred to me rewatching the entire series that one of my biggest problems with these is that, and it really starts especially with the teacher in this movie, whose name is an homage to
Val Luton, right?
Her death is way too over the top. Is so fucking goofy. It is just ridiculous.
Oh, it's ridiculous.
And the idea that, like, I mean, the first couple of deaths are actually pretty solid in this movie, and then you have her death, which is just ridiculous and over the top, and then you have the train sequence, which is pretty great. And that's my biggest problem with the sequels, is like the revenge deaths like really just go over the top. And I think it's the third one, I think, in particular, with the with the two girls who get caught in the tanning beds.
Oh, the tanning beds.
Like, oh my God, this is so absurd. This is so ridiculous. And, you know, it's just overall, like, I mean, and the thing is, it's like, I think especially the first few movies, like the initial vision sequence, like the plane crash in this one, the traffic destruction, you know, the
pile up with the cars and the logs and all that. That is
the second one, and the roller coaster in the third one. Now the roller coaster gets pretty absurd, but at the same time, like, it still works, sort of. And then the next two just really got on my nerves to a certain extent.
Well, I mean, so let me explain my problem with the series in general. Then we'll get back to the first one. Okay, my problem is, okay, so death's design, right? That's what Tony Todd tells us. Hey, it's death's design.
Yeah.
You cheated death. Now death's going to come back to you, and it's not going to be pretty. That's basically the whole theme of this entire series, right? This entire franchise. Okay, but the problem is, once you get past the first movie, it's a one-trick pony.
Yeah, it
right?
is.
It's a one-trick pony.
Mm-hmm.
So, and these films, like, are more formulaic than the Jason films from the 80s.
Which is
like, okay, so inciting incident at the beginning, some big giant some big giant accident, some weird thing out of nowhere is going to kill everybody.
Yeah.
And again, the plane crash kind of made sense, you know? The car collision, that whole thing in the second one even made sense, you know?
Yeah.
There have been pileups like that. Once you get to the roller coaster, and then by the fourth one, they're into like a NASCAR race. It's like, what is going on here?
Well, the fourth,
and then the fifth one I've actually never seen, oddly enough. But that's all like a bridge, right? Don't they have a bridge that collapses?
Yes, it's a bridge. Because I actually had not seen the fifth one until this month. Like because I hated the fourth one so much, I didn't even bother with the fifth one. But
well, don't worry, because the writers didn't bother. The writers didn't bother with the fourth one.
Yeah,
and that's the fucking problem. We'll get back to that in a second. So you have your inciting incident, right? Some big giant pile up bodies everywhere, right? Yeah. That's number one. Okay, so that's fine. That's that. Then you find out, oh, wait a second, this is just a vision, right? Mm-hmm. So whoever our protagonist is going to drag a bunch of people out of whatever situation, cheat death, and then death has to come back and kill everybody in the most ridiculous, mousetrap on top of, flying toaster on top of, Swiss knife on top of a switchblade shot, that type of stuff, right?
Right.
So the problem is, though, by the time I'm to the third one, like, I've already seen this twice. I know what's coming.
Yeah. I
even know when the fake outs are coming, like when someone's going to automatically step out of the way. Oh, the water's coming down from the pipe, which is starting an electrical fire, but she's stepping out of the way to go to the next room, which is going to have the clothesline swing through because the electric fire set the clothesline pole on fire. It's just... Yeah. So even when I'm supposed to get faked out, I'm not getting faked out because I know what's coming. Because I'm smart and I know how to watch movies, So the problem is that, and at least my favorite of all of them is the second one. Because the second one goes out of its way to find ways to tie back to the first one.
Yeah.
Which I thought was just really, really creative the way it went, Mm. And they did a really good job. I mean, it's silly and all. So... But the thing is that, hey, look, I understand what this movie is. I understand that it's a sequel to a popular horror movie. It's not as good as the first one technically, but it's all more fun than the first one, I think,
Right.
But there's all this stuff going on. I mean, and some of the kills in that, the barbed wire kill, the pole blowing through the girl's head when the airbag blows off, and even the thing with the kid getting his teeth pulled. It's just so grotesque. It's silly, but it's a lot of fun, Mm-hmm. So now back to the first one, okay? So the first one was better than the rest because, hey, this is a new idea. I know it's just a variation on a theme, but no one's ever gone this particular version, variation of that version, So that's cool. Mm-hmm. Let's take a look at something different. So I don't understand why all the characters are named after horror luminaries like Val Lewton, all right?
Yeah.
So I wrote a horror comedy with a buddy of mine, it's got to be almost 10 years ago, called Dead Tension. And it's about a zombie outbreak in a high school during detention. And it's a horror comedy, Mm-hmm. So I used the tropes. I'm like, we're just going to go with names of horror people who've been in, actors and directors or whatever who've been in zombie movies, right? But I played it in because the whole thing was like a joke, So it's like, all right, this is just part of a joke that if you're inside and you love zombie movies, you're going to appreciate the names of the characters here,
Yeah.
So that made sense to me to do that. Here, it's like, what the hell does the director of Cat People have to do with this?
Right.
Like, absolutely nothing. It's like, hey, listen, we're horror writers. We figure we're smarter than our audience. So one name is character Val Lewton. So if you look it up on the internet, you'll find out who Val Lewton is,
Yeah, and the funny thing is, at this point, like, the target audience for this movie would not have understood who Val Lewton is. Because...
No, absolutely not. And you have to remember
that available at the time.
You have to remember that back in the year 2002, the internet wasn't what it is today.
Yeah.
So not every kid's going to be running his cell phone going, oh, what's the name Val Lewton mean? Or looking it up on IMDb or whatever,
Yeah, exactly.
So the thing is that, it's just, what really annoys me about it, especially that girl Val Lewton, the teacher, is that there's no tangential reason. There's no direct reason for her to be named that. Like, it's just like horror writers showing off.
Yeah.
I think they kind of carry that out through the series until you get to the fourth one where they just got lazy. So I'm going to read you some of the character names from the IMDb, and I checked these against the credits when I watched it about 6 months ago. You're going to love this. So we have a character in The Final Destination, which is the fourth one, whose name is MILF. And then you have MILF's husband. You have Racist. You have Mechanic and Mechanic's girlfriend, Cowboy, and Racist's wife. So what that tells me is the people who wrote this thing don't give a shit about their characters. So why should I?
Yeah, exactly.
That is so offensive. It's even more offensive than the fact that Michael T. Williamson, who was in Forrest Gump, who we discussed in the last discussion, Oscar wins Forrest Gump. He's in the Final Destination, so obviously he needs a paycheck, poor guy.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm looking at these names and I'm like, dude, you might as well just write the cast and put all the names and right next to them. We don't really give a shit, and neither should you. Just give us our money now. Because by this point, by the time you get to the fourth one, obviously these guys don't care about anything except the paycheck they get, you know?
Yep.
And that's a shame because I never like when I feel like I'm being insulted by a movie. Like, no movie should ever insult me, especially if it wants my $8 at the box office, you know?
Yeah. No, that's absolutely true. No, that is absolutely true. Yeah, and the thing is, it's like it's a shame that Tony Todd isn't involved in the series more. I think he does show back up in the fifth one. I know he's in the second one for a little bit, but it would have been. I think having part of the problem is with this series is the fact that like death is just such an opaque and just such an obscure idea. I feel like to a certain extent you need somebody to verbalize that idea. And as opposed to now, I mean, granted, because otherwise these characters are essentially left on their own. And it's like, I know Tony Todd, probably the only reason he was in this movie, they cast him in this movie, is like, oh, hey, we can get the actor from Candyman in here. And
it's funny that you mentioned that because it got to be 2 years ago. 2 years ago, I went out to dinner with our friend Jeremiah Kipp and a couple other people, and I was interviewing a couple guys, and, we were all having a talk about movies. And Jeremiah brought up this movie, and he said that the reason that Tony Todd was in this is like, hey, you want to get a guy, you need somebody to give you 4 minutes worth of exposition. You want somebody who's going to nail it, be creepy, and hey, he's the Candyman. Yeah. So that's the whole reason for Tony Todd in this movie, which is exactly what you were just saying now. So it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, it's
the other thing that. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, but yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's like, it's like you said, this is such these sequences are just such Rube Goldberg sequences. It's like, oh, we gotta set this up, we gotta set this up, we gotta set this up, and it's like, oh, this this is gonna happen, but it's not quite yet, and the problem with that is if that's all you're relying on as far as your deaths, you're essentially turning these movies into Roadrunner cartoons. Is essentially what it is. It's a feature-length Roadrunner cartoon.
Yeah, well, the thing is, the second one actually connects to the first one, so
yeah,
that makes sense. By the time you get to the third one, it's so obvious because all of a sudden after that, I think, I don't remember what the plane number is. Is it 187? Whatever number the plane is keeps coming up.
Yeah.
180, right? And so, like, after this one, like, when you get to the third one, there's not even any real connection except, ooh, those kids that got off plane 180. And again, if I have some weird coincidence where I think I saw a vision and all my friends died, but now they survived because I got them off whatever. I got them off a roller coaster or the fucking bridge or whatever. And, okay, so now they're all good, okay, so now we're safe. And then they start getting sucked off one by one. I don't think I'm going to go back in my head to 2 years ago when I read a news article about something that happened across the country to 4 more kids got off a plane,
Yeah.
But it's just there's no real connection except, ooh, this is like those kids on Flight 180.
Yeah.
Give me a break, come on. I mean, ooh, this is like those kids who came on Flight 180 because we're all going to die in really Rube Goldberg type ways, and people are going to spend a lot of money to watch this movie,
Yeah, and the thing is, it's like that's where you really do need that's where you really do need a connection with the characters, and you really don't get that in this movie. And it's like, arguably, like, if you were going to make this about survivor's guilt or the nature of life and death, how how we all die. We're just not necessarily sure how. Even if we escape death once, it doesn't necessarily guarantee we'll escape it again. And like the funny thing is, it's like the teacher in this movie, she's arguably the most sympathetic one, because it truly seems like she's having the hardest time of any of these people, of other than Alex, of dealing with what happened to them. And she gets the goofiest death of them all, other than at the very end where basically Ali Larter's entire yard catches on fire. And it's
oh my God! Where it looks like the electricity is actually chasing her across the driveway.
Oh my God! It's so absurd. But I mean, even with the Friday movies, like, or at least even with the better Friday 13th movies, excuse me, because there are some true dogs in that franchise. You get characters that you're at least interested in the best ones. And it's like you get at least some personality of those characters, even if it's on a surface level, but you don't really get that here, and that's kind of part of the problem.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. You could take this concept, right? And if you really wanted to write it well, and again, I never like judging movies on what they didn't do. But again, there's a really scary movie here if you wanted to talk about, instead of Rube Goldberg and all that other stuff and sequels and just, like bridges collapsing or whatever. There is a really scary movie here about some kids who survive death. They're relatively young. When you're their age, you never think you're going to die, Yeah. You haven't even really comprehended life, let alone death at that point. And there's a really scary movie here, if you wanted to write it that way, about survivor guilt, because, the one guy's friend. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff, and the fear. And to get into it a little, it's not well done, but to get into it, I believe, is it Ali? I can't remember. Is it Ali Lauder, or is it Devon Sawa who locks themselves in a room? I think it's Devon Sawa, right? Because he has the whole thing where the cops find them and they chase them in a boat and all that.
Yes.
But again, there's something, like, there's a kernel of something there that they could have developed in the entire movie, and then you'd have something really creepy. I mean, obviously that wasn't their intention. They wanted a popcorn flick that they could make sequels of, you know? Which is fine. I mean, I understand the intention. But if you really, if I were writing this, I would have leaned into that darker direction, because there's some really creepy stuff you could do with that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And unfortunately, and there was the opportunity to make something real out of this, and I understand the intention. You got kids, teenagers go to these movies, they have expendable cash, the characters are expendable and all that,
Yeah.
How do you feel about the ending, by the way? The very ending.
The fact that it essentially comes back, the fact that they basically they survive everything, and then you find out, oh, hey, by the way, it hasn't actually. I mean, that basically. I mean, this is sort of where I liken it to a slasher film, because you always have that ending where it's like, oh, it wasn't quite the ending. It's like you're gonna get at least one more person dead here.
Well, yeah, that's what Jamie Kennedy told us in Scream. Hey, the killer's always gonna get up.
Yeah, I mean, and again, it just those things get so over the top, because the problem is, and part of the problem is the film telegraphs it so much. It's not like it's a sudden shock. I mean, the sudden shocks are what is truly that's what really terrifies me now if I watch a horror movie. Like, I don't know if you've seen Hereditary. Have you seen Hereditary?
Yes, I have.
Okay, so the scene where the son is driving his sister to the emergency room, and something terrible happens. My jaw was on my jaw was practically on the floor in the theater. It's like, oh my God, I can't believe they did that. Like, that is one of the few times I've genuinely been in shock at something a horror movie does. And the problem, I mean, one of the biggest problems with this is it granted, it's about building suspense. I get that. But at the same time, there's building suspense and then there's telegraphing your punches. And this franchise completely just telegraphs your punches.
Well, I mean, here's the thing, okay? Horror is supposed to hit you on a visceral level, right? Literally visceral, because your guts are being torn out, your body's being torn to shreds, you're being bitten and torn and ripped apart, that type of stuff, right?
Yeah.
But my thing is, now that when I was a kid and had, not great taste, Jason Voorhees scared the hell out of me, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's all about the visceral reaction.
Yeah.
Like, my thing is, as I got older and I got more studied and started to take English classes and read all kinds of stuff, I became very educated and intelligent, well read. My thing is that horror, I appreciate the visceral level, but it also should hit me on an emotional and sometimes on a, on an intellectual level.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because a movie like, a franchise like this, this is not this franchise doesn't care about anything but the visceral,
Right.
It wants to say, hey, listen, you got off that plane, but I'm going to tear you to shreds anyway.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to take your head off. Now, what I didn't like about the ending, the very ending, is that, and I don't want to give anything away for anyone else that's seen it, but it doesn't give you have to wait till the next movie to find out what happened to a couple characters, which I just thought was a cheat.
This is true.
The whole, hey, the sign's going to fall down and the screen goes blank is a total ripoff.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, and again, right. I don't mind open-ended movies. Now, I'm not crazy about them. I believe that everything in life should come to some kind of closure, but sometimes you don't get closure on things.
Right.
So I understand that when I see a movie with an open ending. But that is just like cheap because, hey, now you got to come back to see if they're even alive or not. That's a cheat. And I hate that.
Well, there's leaving a movie open-ended, and then there's leaving a movie incomplete. Which
is what I felt with that, yeah.
What kind of happens at the end of Final Destination, where it's like, oh, hey, and this is why so many sequel setups are just so blatantly gratuitous and absurd, because they assume that, oh, hey, you want a sequel to this, right? Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
But yeah, it's like, let's move on from. We could talk a lot about. We could talk maybe a little bit more about Final Destination, but I do.
No, I'm fine. I think we've covered the material more than well enough.
So I think the way I want to structure this particular episode is I want to basically move through the genre in terms. We start off with the most quote unquote purely horror genre film, and we're going to move now to another one that's very much in the horror vein, but you're getting more into science fiction, but it still has that horror shape, and that is Paul Verhoeven's Hollow Man.
So before we go any further, okay?
Yeah.
I contend that it's since 2000 that if that movie was made by Universal Studios, the title would not be Hollow Man, it would be The Invisible Man.
Oh, yeah. I thought about this movie a lot when I was watching the new Invisible Man from earlier this year. Yeah, I thought about
this movie, if made by a different studio, would be called The Invisible Man, and that would have been your first Invisible Man remake.
Right. And
which, I would have appreciated, but I'm fine with Hollow Man. It's something different.
Yeah, so we go to Hollow Man, which is written by Andrew Marlowe. He's one of the writers. He is best known for creating Castle, the TV show, but he was also coming off of Air Force One, which was also by Columbia Pictures.
Okay.
This was Paul Verhoeven's final Hollywood film. It kind of I don't know why. I don't know. Maybe I'm curious to see why. I'm curious why it ended up being his last one, and why his next film ended up going back to being a foreign film in the Black Book. But so we've discussed, this is essentially The Invisible Man, and Kevin Bacon plays a really dickish egomaniac scientist who is experimenting with invisibility for the military. It's for military purposes. They start off by using it on animals, and the first thing we see is them working on bringing back a gorilla back to visibility, and we see that happen. And sure enough, it's, even though the military is uneasy about continuing the project because of actually some lying on Sebastian's part, if I remember correctly. Sebastian wants to go ahead and try on humans, and naturally he tries on himself, and it works on himself. But the problem is, the same serum that worked on bringing the animal, on the gorilla, back to visibility isn't working on humans. And so Sebastian is basically stuck being invisible. And so I think to a certain extent, you're supposed to be thinking about, well, is the amount of time that he's spending as invisible making him crazy, or is that just naturally him? And if you watch this movie, you can kind of tell it's naturally him. But needless to say, he gets restless just staying in the lab, and some criminal activity begins. And the thing is, this movie actually has it's got a pretty stacked cast, actually, if you think about it.
Oh, it does. First off, Kevin Bacon is totally committed. I've always liked Kevin Bacon.
Oh,
I think he's a great actor.
Yeah.
And I think that even when he's in even if he's in a shitty movie, you're not going to get a shitty performance out of him. He's just solid in everything. He's been that way for a long, and he's been in the business. I mean, he's in Friday the 13th, the original one, and that's 40 years, and he even did, I think that was after Animal House.
It was after.
A couple years after.
Yes.
It was.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're talking a guy who's been in the business 4+ decades, and he's always, I don't think I've ever seen him give a bad performance.
Yeah.
Even if he's in something really goofy, he's always committed, which is nice. Mm-hmm. You have Elizabeth Shue, who is putting on some really good acting.
Yep.
You have Josh Brolin.
Yeah.
Josh Brolin, before all the Thanos and all the other stuff, he's become much more famous for these days. So you have a solid core of actors, and then that's part of it too, that you realize at the beginning. So they're all co-workers, and you're supposed to assume, I guess, you're supposed to take it from what you've seen, that Josh Brolin is friends with Kevin Bacon.
Yeah.
Kevin Bacon, I believe, if I have this straight, was in a relationship at one point with Elizabeth Shue, but she's not sleeping with Josh Brolin. Isn't that the way it works?
That is correct.
So you have a guy in Bacon's character, Sebastian, who is, and again, this goes right back. Like, a lot of the setup here I should be annoyed with, but I'm not, because it's done really well. Like, this goes right back to Colin Clive. I'm sorry, my memory's a little shot, but basically the guy who played Edward Frankenstein back in the original Frankenstein. Mm-hmm. So you have the whole thing where the egotistic doctor who's going to push it to the end, and he's got no limits, and he wants to, he doesn't care about anything but the project and the quest for, knowledge. It should be only God's, because let's face it, a lot of these creative movies where the creation goes awry, it always comes back to that. You're stealing power that should be God. It's Prometheus. You're going to hang yourself up on the tree at the end, right?
Mm-hmm.
So long story short, you have that. You have him, and you could tell right from the beginning that he's cocky and he doesn't care. And then you have the whole trope where the military wants to pull the money, because that always has to happen in these movies. He doesn't want to wait. He doesn't want the project to get shut down. There's a million movies like this with the same setup. So he decides to experiment on himself. But if you watch the original Invisible Man back in 1930-something with Claude Rains, it's the same setup there,
Yeah.
He decides to, do the same thing, and he goes crazy. Now, I would assess it and say that Claude Rains' character in the original Invisible Man and Kevin Bacon's character, Sebastian and Sahalman, have the same problem. That this is just a natural extension, because now they have these godlike powers. They were arrogant and crazy to begin with, and their further slide into craziness isn't really so much based on the fact that they're invisible, but the fact that they think they're gods, and they always have. Now they just have some godlike powers.
Yep.
That make sense?
Yep.
So the problem with Sebastian, again, is that, you realize that, like you said, he's kind of a dick at the beginning before everything goes awry, right?
Yeah.
And then, he takes. So you have to say to yourself, if this were an '80s screwball comedy and the kid turns invisible, he's going to go in the girl's locker room, right? Because that's what, back in the '80s, screwball sex comedies, that's what you would do.
Yep.
Because this is an arrogant fuck who thinks he can get away with anything and he's all powerful, he takes this in a direction which ties us into Carrie too a little bit, where you have the whole toxic masculinity thing. Mm-hmm. So he's got this hot neighbor who lives across the way. He looks out his window at her sometimes. So there's a very terrifying scene. I'm not a woman, but I would assume it would be more terrifying if you were a woman, where, he's got the invisible powers and she's dicking around her apartment or whatever. Maybe she just got out of the shower. And then, all of a sudden you realize that he's there in her apartment without her knowledge. And I don't really, I always took it that he rapes her after the camera. They don't show it, but I always took it that he had his way with raping.
No, that's been my interpretation of it too. And you don't see her again. But honestly,
no, you never see her again.
And that scene, this is where I'm not sure. This is where, on the one hand, it's very much a Verhoeven movie, because he was always somebody to push the boundaries when it comes to sexuality, when it comes to violence. You basically look at his entire Hollywood career. If you just
this is the guy who directed Basic Instinct. So yeah,
and Showgirls and Starship
Yes,
Troopers,
absolutely.
and RoboCop and Total Recall. And it's one of those things where it's like, this is very much a Verhoeven movie through and through. The question is that a good thing for the movie? And I'm not sure that it is. Because...
Well, I think that if you want to take the movie on its terms, I think that, I'm not a huge fan of Verhoeven's. I'm not. But this particular movie is very well made.
Yeah.
It's very well acted. And there are some, first off, I remember when I first, because this was I bought my first DVD player in 2000, and this was within the first couple weeks, I bought a whole bunch of DVDs because it was new toy for me, and this was one of them. And there's a feature on there about how they do the invisible effects with the gorilla, which is absolutely fascinating, because there are some great special effects in this movie.
There are. The visual effects in this movie are one of the best things about this movie.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think that if you want to take it on its terms, I think it's a very well-made movie, and I think Verhoeven was perfect for that because he's willing to push those boundaries. Because let's face it, when you get into the stuff where it looks like he's going to rape and violently murder people, this is not a safe movie anymore, you know? And this is one of those movies where, again, I talked about primal fears before. It's the unseen assailant, which is creepy, okay? No one wants to go down that dark alley in the middle of the night where you think you might get raped, mugged, / killed, whatever,
Yeah.
Because you can't see what's down that alley, And you always hear about the light at the end of the tunnel when people try to put a positive spin on it. But if you're going into that tunnel and it's pitch black, you got plenty to fear, And I think that Verhoeven really does that well, where he says, all right, well, what can I do with this guy that's going to terrify people? How can I do it where they're going to be afraid to be in a room? I mean, I'm in my room right now. I don't see anything around that's kind of salty, you know, but if Kevin Bacon's here and invisible, how the hell am I going to know, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that vulnerability lends to the creepiness and what's really scary about that film.
Yeah, I mean, and you brought up the toxic masculinity before, and I think if the part of my problem with this movie in those terms is I think it's just gratuitous when Verhoeven's doing that in this movie. I think it's as gratuitous as the beaver shot in Basic Instinct. It just it doesn't really serve much of a purpose because of the fact that it's like Sebastian is we see him start to undress and molest Kim Dickens' character. We see a nightmare of Elizabeth Shoes where basically Sebastian is invisible and essentially rapes her. And it's we've seen this after. I think we see both of those after the scene where he assaults the woman across the way from him. And it's if it were just, and I mean this is part of where it's it's a Verhoeven movie, but at the same time it's so gratuitous. I mean, if you want to do a film about toxic masculinity when it comes to his premise, I think the new Invisible Man does a very successful job of that. I don't think this does. Because the new Invisible Man, it basically is him terrorizing her and basically he's basically gaslighting her. And it's this is just, Kevin Bacon's character just being an amplified version of Kevin Bacon's character we already knew. And it's it's not as interesting as it could have been, because it's sort of like a lot of the complaints that people have of Jack Nicholson in The Shining, where it's if, Jack Nicholson, who Jack Nicholson is as a personality, so you're not surprised when he goes crazy later on in the film.
Well, I think you and I discussed this recently, where I said that part of the reason that King purists hate that movie is because I've read the novel long after I saw the movie, but I read the novel, and the novel, is basically about a guy's, descent into madness and alcoholism, and issues. Whereas as soon as you see Jack Nicholson in the car driving the family there, and the kids, standing up in the seat, and mom's talking about whatever, and he's got that crazy Jack Nicholson smile. I mean, he's already insane at that point.
Yep.
Which is why King fans now can't stand that. King purists can't stand that movie because it's a whole different character. Mm-hmm. And like you said, once you see Jack Nicholson, you're going to get an over-the-top, crazy-ass performance,
Yeah.
You know that it's going in that direction. Even if you've never heard of The Shining, you could see that first 10 minutes of that movie, you know where it's going,
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think that part of the problem that you're having with this, and it was Verhoeven the right man for this movie, like you asked before, my take on it is Verhoeven has this way of being really artful and really trashy at the same time.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some beautifully shot stuff in Basic Instinct, let's say, some really nice scenes, some really well thought out, well planned. But that story is garbage. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And my thing is, okay, Verhoeven's the kind of guy who's going to put in that beaver shot because he wants to titillate as much as he wants to frighten.
Yeah.
He wants to get you, because he's pushing your buttons here. He's saying, hey, here's the sex button, here's the horror button, here's the scare button, here's the, hey, you have an erection button,
Yeah.
So he's trying to get you from both ends. and he's trying to be really artful on the high end, but on the low end, he won't. I don't think there's any way he won't anywhere that he could go that wouldn't be too low for him. You know?
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what people like about Verhoeven. Like, I never really liked RoboCop, and I think the problem was when I saw it in the 80s as a kid, all I saw was the violence, because I didn't understand satire.
Yeah.
I didn't understand social commentary. I didn't understand any of that stuff at that point, you know? So all I saw was a metallic guy blowing people's arms off after his entire body got blown away, right? But people that love that, I mean, let's face it, if you want to talk about why RoboCop is so, why people love it and revere it to this day, 35, 40 years later, it's got all kinds of, you know, high-end ideas about society and what we do to ourselves and what we do, hey, making a man a machine and corporate America, and it's got all these highfalutin ideas. And it's also got, you know, basically people raping and blowing each other's arms off and shooting each other in the dicks, you know? So, I mean, that's what Verhoeven is all about. He's like, hey, here's the high end I'm going to touch, and here's all the stuff that's, you know, highfalutin and beautiful visuals and, you know, big ideas. But I'm not worried. I'm not afraid to go into the garbage can outside in the street either, you know?
Right.
So, was he the right director? Was he the right director for that movie? If you want to see a Verhoeven movie and you want to see his take on the Invisible Man, yes. If you're looking for something that's more highbrow, more terrifying, you know, not leaning into the whole toxic masculinity thing, he's absolutely the wrong director for that movie.
Yeah.
And I think it's really fascinating that we touched on Carrie too, because, you know, the whole thing is, I mean, with the Me Too movement a couple of years ago and all the discussions we had about Carrie when we talked, you know, a while back, you know, is that Kevin Bacon is the kind of guy you never want to meet in a bar if you're a woman. Kevin Bacon is the kind of guy you never want to work for. Kevin Bacon, I should say Sebastian, because Kevin Bacon, I'm sure, is a great guy. He always had to experiment with him for a long time. Sebastian is the kind of guy you never want to meet in a bar if you're a woman. Sebastian is the kind of guy you never want to work for. Probably if you're a guy, but even more so if you're a woman. You know? Sebastian's the type of guy you never want to be in a relationship with, because all he's going to do is take and dominate and abuse, because that's what he is. You know? And it's no different from those creeps in Carrie too, saying, hey, we filmed this, I'm going to show it to everybody at this party because, you know, we don't want you to have a life. We're going to play this game, you know, because those creepy kids in Carrie 2 and Kevin Bacon's character Sebastian aren't looking at women as women or human beings. They're looking at women as objects, and that's just disgusting. You know? That's terrible. No guy should ever, and I'm telling you, I've seen a million of these guys in bars that are just like that. You know, that once the door shuts, that woman's going to be in bad shape, you know? Because it's just a game to them, and it's all about, and the whole thing about toxic masculinity is it comes out of empowerment, right? So Sebastian's whole thing, and again, this goes back to Colin Clive and Dracula, and Frankenstein, rather, way back in the 30s, you know, 1931. It's all about, hey, listen, I'm the smartest guy in the room. I figured out how to be a god, you know? I figured out how to, now I am the one you should worship. I should be able to dominate you. And the whole thing is, when that goes unchecked, whether because you're taking body parts and you make a 7-foot monster, or you find a formula to make you invisible and therefore very hard to catch, you know, basically that's giving those guys what they think is godlike power. And that's the problem. So it's toxic masculinity, but that's just a portion of it because it's also mixed in with the God complex, you know? I mean, when you're creating formulas that you think are going to help the military or make people invisible or make dinosaurs or whatever, you become a god in your mind at that point. You know? And that is a huge part of that problem. Now, if you're viewing it in that lens, that's a horrible movie to watch, not just because it's a horror flick, you know? But I think that Verhoeven handles all that pretty well, and I feel that Kevin Bacon, you know, if you have a lesser actor in that point, it just becomes either camp or it becomes boring, you know? I think that having Kevin Bacon in that role elevated that flick to a place it might not have been had you had a lesser actor in there.
No, that is a fair point. That is a very good point. All of what you just said makes a lot of sense. I think, in thinking about what you were saying, I think part of the reason the film doesn't quite work for me as much as it did when I first saw it in 2000 is the fact that it's like if you're going to look at this as in terms of toxic masculinity, I think you need a strong anchor on the other side that will sort of counterbalance that. And the other characters in this movie, I don't think you get that. And now, I mean, granted, the actors do, Elizabeth Shue, Josh Brolin, Kim Dickens especially, they do as good of a job as I think you can, but
sure.
None of them are really you don't necessarily have that strong antagonist character that really will you can sort of buy into being able to rein in Sebastian.
No, and I agree with that as well. I think that I think that Elizabeth Shue is more than serviceable.
Yeah.
I think they're giving that script is, but it would have been a lot more interesting, I think, if it were her project.
Yeah.
And he were the subordinate, because then the roles would be reversed. She'd be in a better power position. And I could see his character being as arrogant as he is, thinking that he's going to die under her, and what guy of his brilliance would ever want that? I think if that would have switched the power dynamic, and again, never like to talk about movies for what they should be, but I think that if you switch their roles, you're looking at a different movie, and that's probably more suitable to what you're talking about that way.
Yeah, but so taking the movie as is, I think Bacon is terrific in this movie. The visual effects, which you touched on, are terrific. It's funny that you said that this was sort of like one of the first DVDs that you bought when you started to get into DVDs. This was actually one of my first ones too, and it was because of the isolated score commentary by Jerry Goldsmith. And I love Jerry Goldsmith's score. He probably, and we talked about this a little bit after I watched it recently, where it's like he writes probably some of the best suspense and mystery music this side of Bernard Herrmann.
Jerry Goldsmith has always been my favorite composer. I know John Williams gets a lot more credit, and has what people generally consider to be the better scores. But Jerry Goldsmith is just brilliant. I mean, when you look at some of the stuff, I'm just going to name 3 movies. So the Planet of the Apes, the original one back in '68, you look at that score and it's like, wow, this is avant-garde. This is crazy. Like, what am I looking at? What am I listening to?
Yeah.
Then you get to my favorite horror movie of all time, The Omen, with the Ave Satana and the Gregorian chants. And I'm like, wow, this is just that's one of those movies where if that had a different score, it would not be nearly as effective as it is.
Yeah.
And then you go to 1984 and you're looking at Gremlins, and Gremlins is like a big party with the music,
Yes.
I mean, he's done everything from those flicks. He did the Rambo score, the original one for First Blood, and he did this. The guy's and again, he died way too young, he's just an amazing composer.
No,
and you being a music guy, I could totally see why you'd appreciate the isolated score on this, because it's a great score.
Yeah, and the fact is, it's like he was Goldsmith. I do love Williams probably more, but I think to a certain extent Goldsmith had better range. And I think in the 3 scores that you just explained, you just brought up, explain why. You have the adventure that's very avant-garde in Planet of the Apes. You have the horror that is very dramatic, very epic in a way of The Omen. And then you have the just madcap lunacy of Gremlins. And I mean, he's somebody who was very much comfortable in any genre. And that was one of the things that was, I mean, I think his last score was Looney Tunes Back in Action.
I think it was.
And it's one of those things where it's like, I understand why Williams ended up, I understand why Williams ended up getting more of the acclaim because he wrote the bigger themes, he wrote the more iconic themes. But the fact is, it's like I understand a lot of film. I think a lot of film music fans appreciate Goldsmith more, and it's because of I do think it's probably because of that versatility that you hear in his music and his choice in films and the film went with.
I love John Williams scores. Like the scores of my childhood: Star Wars, Superman, Jaws, all those flicks. You know, I love and revere every one of those scores. But all those scores are big and epic and, you know, huge, you know, tremendous pieces, you know, like huge, that you couldn't imagine those films without them.
Yep.
But what I really have always loved about Goldsmith can cater to any type of film. So, like, if you look at, like you said, the way you just described those three films, like, you couldn't come up with three films more different than the original Planet of the Apes, The Omen, and Gremlins, right? Mm-hmm. But all three of those films, even though they're vastly different, he fit the music to each one of them perfectly.
Yes.
You know? So there's that versatility, like you said. And he's always been my favorite composer as far as movies go, because, you know, it's just that I don't think I've ever heard a score from him that wasn't great, you know, that I didn't have fun with.
Yeah, and the second the opening credits of Hollow Man came up, I'm like, God, he knew how to write a mystery score. Like the second though that music really starts to kick in during the opening credits, it's like, oh, I remember why I love Goldsmith's suspense scores so much. It's because of the fact that it's so simple, it's so simple, and to a certain extent, you hear echoes of his score for Basic Instinct and Hollow Man, but at the same time, it's also a different as the movie goes on, it's a completely different personality as Basic Instinct is too, and it's the same filmmaker and composer. And so, and that is, and I'll admit, you will occasionally get that with Spielberg and Williams, but not on the same levels you did with Goldsmith.
Sure.
And but yeah, the visual effects in this movie are terrific. I like the visual effects still work for me for the most part in this movie. The invisibility, the way they did the invisibility, and the way they shot the scenes where, you know, they're following invisible beings in this movie are just really terrific. And this movie, this movie definitely has its strong suits. There are definitely things that are very strong about this movie. Overall, though, it's like this movie. It's not the biggest drop in, you know, the way I feel about it of the movies that we're talking about tonight. We're about to get to that one, but at the same time, it's one where it's like, yeah, this one I'm not sure how I feel about now. But I'm glad.
Well, but isn't that a great part of movies, though? Like, I'll give you an example. I think the first time I saw the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is in my 6 favorite horror films, right? With Kevin McCarthy, and there's a committed performance, and everything is like great about that movie. I've seen that movie probably more than 100 times in my life. Every time I watch that movie, I get something different out of that.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'm watching for the paranoia, right? And I pick up on that. Sometimes I'm watching, and there's a really beautiful romance that has some horrible things to it in that. Sometimes I'm watching it, and I'm picking up on, you know, how townspeople deal with each other. So every time I watch that thing, I'm seeing something different. So I think it's great that you feel differently about these movies because, you know, the first time you saw Hollow Man was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think that if it's bringing something different to the table, that's because you have 20 years worth of experience in life and movie watching. Mm-hmm. And I think that if you were seeing it exactly the same way, it's probably not the type of movie that's going to stand out, you know?
Yeah. I mean, it's either that or it's you know, I mean, I look at, you know, to use an example, I mean, you know, the original Star Wars is one of my favorite movies of all time. And it's a movie where that movie is a very, very much kind of a comfort movie to me. It
Sure.
doesn't really change. It doesn't. My feelings about it now, anytime I watch it, don't necessarily change. I mean, they're really kind of settled in at this point in my life. But at the same time, it's the same movie. It's the same movie as it has been for a number of years, and that's fine. That's fine by me. But yeah, you're right, especially on movies like Hollow Man, where it's like, or some of these movies just in general, it's like, yeah, I can tell that the reason I feel differently about these movies now than I did then is because of the increased experience I have with movies, with life in general, and it's one of those things where it's like that's that aids me in watching some of these films now compared to when I watched them then. So,
Well, I mean, look, there are flicks that I've watched, sometimes even just a couple of years ago, where I'm like, I'll be in a certain mood when I see it for the first time. Like, that's a great movie.
yeah.
And then I'll watch it a subsequent time, 6 months later, and be like, what the fuck was I thinking? That's garbage,
Yeah.
Because I think that it also, like, I grew up as a kid in the 80s, and I remember Star Wars came out in 77, so I would have been 5 at the time. And I remember my mom distinctly bringing me and my brother, was only 3 at the time. I remember my mom taking us to Port Jefferson on Long Island in New York. I remember the theater. I remember the popcorn, And every time I watch the original Star Wars, all those feelings and all those emotions I have come back to me, So I understand that as well. Like, there's a certain comfort, like you said.
Yeah.
And growing up, when I grew up, like, all those movies like that, and Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and the Star Wars movies, and those type of things. It's not just, hey, this is a movie. Hey, this was an experience I had when I was a kid. So I totally understand that. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. There's a Hollow Man 2, isn't there?
Yes, there is.
I have never seen it. I have no desire to see it, and probably will never see it.
Yeah, same here. Yeah, it's funny. There's actually, if I remember correctly, I think there's a sequel to our next film. Which,
oh God,
again,
really?
I think if let me jump on IMDb right quickly.
Oh my! I don't even know how you would make that work.
Let's see. Okay, so it's there is in fact it was made in 2009. It seems to have sort of a similar premise to Tarsum's The Cell, but it seems like it sort of twists it into more of a horror bent, where it's like the serial killer actually is bringing his victims back to life. I guess I'm not even gonna bother to finish reading it. I'm
okay. So
I'm
with
Hollow Man 2. I'm never gonna watch this movie.
I'm right there with you on that one. I'm never watching The Cell 2, I promise you.
So
you have my word on that.
So that brings us to Tarsum's The Cell, which starts off.
Before you start, I'm going to let you explain this one because I'm not even sure I can explain this one. So have at it, brother. It's all you.
So the quick description I wrote down in my notes here was the movie is essentially Inception, a decade before Inception.
Okay.
That is it's as quick of a description as I can give. So basically, the movie is really kind of two movies, because the one movie, you have a child therapist played by Jennifer Lopez who uses an experimental technology that allows her to go into the mind of another human being and converse with the subconscious conscious of that person. In this case, at the start, it's a boy who's been in a coma for several months. on the other end of this, you have Carl Starger, who is a serial killer played by the fantastic Vincent D'Onofrio, who really cannot give a bad performance if he tried.
I'm also convinced it's certifiably insane, but yeah, that plays into the character.
So he's a serial killer who tortures his victims in cells that fill with water, and he also hangs himself above the corpses from clamps as sort of a penance. We'll come to find out that he came from an abusive home. He also suffers from a schizophrenic disorder that is triggered and after he's captured his most recent victim, and he is discovered by the police, led by Vince Vaughn's character, and he is in a coma. So they, in an attempt to try to find his latest victim, they take Carl to Catherine and ask her to essentially enter his mind. It's essentially Inception as a serial killer thriller.
Okay, so I'm going to relate this back to Final Destination real quick, because there is a connection here, whether you would want to think that or not, or believe that or not. So there is a subplot in Final Destination that goes absolutely nowhere. Could have saved us about 12 minutes of film time if they cut it out, and you would not have made, it would have made the movie better. There is a subplot where the police seem to think that Devon Sawa's character somehow blew up the plane.
Yes.
And that they are chasing him. There's a scene where he runs out of the house and he runs in this little lifeboat or paddle boat or whatever. And the police have the guns out, they're chasing him, and he gets in the water. And you'd think that they were the wicked witches of the West and they're going to melt if they step in the wake. Because he's about 12 feet out there, the guns out, and they're like, oh, well, he got away. Yeah. So that whole thing could have been totally removed.
Right.
Do you agree with me on that? Because I don't think that served any real purpose.
I completely forgot about it until you brought it up. So yes, it could.
Exactly, because it's that important to the plot that you forgot about it. So here's one of my many problems with this film. Okay, basically, the whole police procedural thing gets kind of grafted onto this weird science fiction horror flick.
Yes.
So like you said, you're really dealing with two different movies at one time. Yeah. And they don't really blend together so well.
No, it doesn't.
Also, I think Vince Vaughn and Jennifer Lopez have absolutely no chemistry in that film at all.
I would agree with that assessment. Yeah.
Vince Vaughn's one of those guys that I've always thought is better when he's funny roles, like Dodgeball and that type of stuff.
Yes.
Those type of movies, because he's just not a great dramatic actor.
No.
If you ever want to see how great a dramatic actor he is not, watch him as Norman Bates in the Psycho remake that Gus Van Sant made. But the problem is that you have no chemistry between these two leads. You have this police story that you really don't need, because they could have found an easier way to hook this up. They really didn't need the police procedural thing at all. So, that's just on the story level, and the acting level, it doesn't work. It doesn't function for me at all. And again, here's another one of those, I believe, hey, your project's not working, so we're threatening to pull the money, because that's exactly what happened in Hollow Man, too.
Yeah.
I could figure that if she were bright enough, she would not be personally entering the minds of criminals and kids in comas. Right. But again, that always tends to happen in these movies, so I'm not surprised.
No, and that's actually a good point. This actually does share a couple of different things in common with the movies that we've discussed. So, hey, we found a commonality between these three movies, and other than the fact that they all came out in the same year. No,
Leave it to us to go above and beyond and make those connections for your audience.
You are absolutely correct when it comes to police procedural parts. It's so generic in this movie. It's like Tarsem Singh and composer Howard Shore tried to make that exciting. It feels like to a certain extent, because this is New Line and 7 was New Line, it feels like, oh, we're going to basically do like a different version of 7 in a way. We're going to try and make, David Fincher made the serial killer movie exciting and interesting in 7. We can do the same in the cell. No, it's not. But Tarsem is funny, the way he uses like slow motion and stuff like that in this movie is so tiring. It's so transparently an attempt to make all of that stuff visually interesting, and there's no way to make it visually interesting. And
well, here's my thing with Tarsem. Okay, I don't know how familiar you are with Lucio Fulci. Have you ever watched Fulci's films?
I've not. I know the name, but I have not seen any of his films.
So let me explain Lucio Fulci to you real quick. There are two schools of zombie fans who love zombie films in the 70s and 80s. There's the George Romero fans who tend to love the American versions, and then there's the Lucio Fulci fans who tend to love the Italian stuff, right?
Yeah.
So my big thing about Lucio Fulci is he has some really stunning, beautiful images and the biggest garbage trash stories that I've ever seen in my fucking life. And here's why. Because that's a director who is strictly concerned with the visuals. It doesn't matter if the visuals don't make any sense.
Yeah.
People who love Fulci will tell you that his films are a tone poem. No, I don't buy that at all, but they'll tell you that, okay? Because it's all about the visuals. It's not about, it's again, and there's a lot of visual stuff and eye poking in there. But there's a director who's more concerned with what he's showing you and throwing the story right out the window.
Right.
Tarsem, I would say, is the same exact thing. Tarsem obviously cares about visuals well over story because it gets so convoluted and so confusing. And there's two versions of Starja, and there's the demon version, the kid version, but then there's the other kid who's in his dream, but she's in his. I can't even. If I had a map in front of me with all this drawn out, I couldn't figure this out.
Yeah.
The thing is, there are some beautiful, gory, scary, very high art visuals in that film.
Yes.
Great stuff.
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, the story is absolute garbage and it's unnecessary. I think that the cell would have worked better for me as a picture book, with great scenes and pictures than actually watching it for 2 hours as a movie,
Well, and the thing is yeah, you're absolutely right. The reason I adored this movie when I saw it in 2000. I loved this movie in 2000. I gave it my highest grade in 2000. I don't give it my highest grade now. And it's because of, and I think what happened in 2000 is I was so struck by the images and the music that I didn't really like. I wasn't really paying much attention to just how generic and sort of pop psychology everything was in this movie. Like, there's so much pop psychology in this movie as far as the psychological aspect. Like, the idea of Carl's character is like, the abused character becomes an abuser himself, and, all the psychological aspects of it. It's like, it's interesting, and the visuals are beautiful. You're absolutely right, and it's like the funny thing is, it you can tell that Tarsem is a music video director, like more than just about any other music video director's turn to filmmaking. You can tell that he is a music video director because this film essentially. So many of the images that are just big and imaginative, and you don't forget from this movie, don't really make much sense emotionally when it comes to the story. Like, it's just like by putting this into the subconscious, it's like, okay, this makes no sense whatsoever. And it's like, at least with Inception, it's like, Christopher Nolan didn't try to like create. I mean, other than when it went to Limbo at the very end, like there wasn't anything like just ridiculously unnatural going on visually in Inception. It was, and that's the case with this. It's very much like every little time we go into Carl or Edward's subconscious or Catherine's subconscious, it's like, oh, hey, look, this is essentially a new, different music video, and that's kind of the problem with this movie overall.
Well, I want to circle back to something that you said about the pop psychology that has always annoyed me about this flick too. So, by giving us that background, I've always thought that this flick wants us to sympathize with Carl Stodger once we find out he was abused.
Yeah.
But I find it very hard to sympathize with a guy who locks women in glass cells and drowns them. You know?
Yeah.
So, fundamentally, on a moral level, I mean, that's another problem I have with this movie. Like, I can't go that far. I don't care that you were abused. I understand that. I definitely, I can empathize with that. I feel terrible. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't give you the right to go kill women either, So I always thought that it wanted me to, it kind of twists things, because then, it splits him off where you have the two, like I said before, you have two versions of Carl Stodger inside somebody's head.
Yeah.
So there's this hulking, and outright, I don't get scared by much in horror movies, but Vincent D'Onofrio, when he's in the makeup and he's all pumped up, and he's got the, he looks like a snake demon, I mean, that's some terrifying shit. Yeah. No doubt. But, you have that, and you have him playing out against, hey, here's the little kid, and it's really weird, because it's like the movie wants me to sympathize with the kid version of him, but it's literally demonized the adult version. So how the hell am I supposed to think about this character? Right. That's what I'm saying. It works much better on a visual level. If you were to look at this as a series of portraits, like if you would take scenes from each of those scenes that we talked about, and put them on a wall in a museum, you could have a really fascinating, display.
Yeah.
Putting it in a movie, it's nonsense. It's terrible.
Yeah, you need.
And I wish it made more sense, because if you had the high level of story that you do with the visuals, you'd have one of the greatest horror movies of all time.
Yeah. Yeah, and the thing is, it's like, and that's the problem with this movie, where it's like the part that drags it down is essentially the part that's trying to stay grounded in the same way that Seven was, and the same way as Silence of the Lambs was, where it's like it's trying to be like a real, it's trying to be a police movie, it's trying to be a procedural thriller, but it's, it just, that part is so thin compared to, and really, I mean, all of the depth is superficial too. Like you were saying, I mean, if you put like individual images from this movie in like an art gallery as like an art, sort of an art exhibition, like you'd have a really interesting art exhibition. But the problem is you can't transition that into a 2-hour movie where half of the movie is this very generic cop thriller.
Absolutely. And that's, a big part of the problem I've always had with this film.
Yeah.
I think that it aims high on the visuals, absolutely. Mm-hmm. I think it could have used several rewrites on the script. I think it could have taken out the whole cop aspect. There are better ways to do that. But again, I hadn't even thought about that. That Seven was probably still in everybody's mind at that point. It is New Line, and they're probably like, hey, let's throw a police procedural in there. Mm-hmm. But Seven, like you said, and Silence of the Lambs, those movies are grounded in a certain reality.
Yeah.
A certain visceral, nasty take on reality, but a certain reality. Mm-hmm. Whereas this thing, it's like I'm floating. I told you, I can't even figure out whose head I'm in half the time.
Yeah.
If she's going to go into people's heads, but they're going to go into her head, which could affect her for life, and she might die if she dies in a dream. Mm-hmm. I mean, what is going on?
That's absolutely right.
I just wish that movie had a better story. I really do.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you left Vince Vaughn in there and found some other way for him to be in there, there were better ways to go about it. And, I think that Carson, from everything from watching the movie, I don't think gave a fuck about the plot at all. I think it's, hey, listen, I'm going to put my beautiful images, my beautiful, gory, scary images on the screen, and for 2 hours you're going to watch and you're going to enjoy it,
Yeah.
Do you know how, I know that it made money when it came out, was to sell, critically? How did people take it critically? Do you have any idea?
I think it got relatively mixed reviews. I remember Roger Ebert loving it, and was because of the images first and foremost.
Of course.
But yeah, I mean, I think it got relatively mixed reviews for the most part.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
That's one of those movies, too, where you can just look at it and say, wow, this movie is not for everybody, No. This is not like a mass appeal type. This is not Final Destination. This is a whole different ball of wax from that.
Yeah, and
but has he made subsequent films, Carson?
Yeah, he did a movie a few years later called The Fall, which I was not that big of a fan of, and then he did a movie called Immortals a few years after.
Oh my God, that's right. That's when I heard about him. Oh Jesus, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So, and I can't remember what else he's done other than those, but I mean, those are the other two that I'm familiar with.
And somehow there was a Cell 2 that we're never going to watch.
Yeah, and which I don't understand at all. I mean, yeah, it's I don't know. Let's not worry about too much though, and let's go to the fourth film that we are going to talk about. This was one that we added kind of at the last minute a few weeks ago. And
can I just jump in here for a second, if you don't mind?
Yeah, that's fine.
So the reason I mentioned this film, all right, is because I don't know why, but a couple of weeks ago I'm like, hey, it's October, Halloween's coming shortly, haven't really watched any horror movies. I'm in the mood to do vampires. So I've watched in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I guess, 6 or 7 vampire flicks, right? And then when I looked at the year, like I said, I pulled up, just typed in Google Horror Movies 2000, Shadow of the Vampire was there. I'm like, wow. We're talking about such trash here that it would be nice if we were actually talking about a really good horror film. Yes. And that's why I suggested that. So thank you for taking my suggestion so we can end on a high note. Appreciate that.
Yes, and I appreciate that you suggested it because of the fact that it gave me a chance to search it out so I could watch it again, because I did always have affection for this movie. It is Shadow of the Vampire, which imagines the filming of the F.W. Murnau masterpiece Nosferatu in a way where we posed that the idea that Max Schreck, the actor who played Nosferatu, Count Orlok in the Murnau film, was an actual vampire.
Yes.
And the thing that I realized right away in rewatching this film, I hadn't seen it since 2001, was I forgot how much of a degree of dark comedy that this movie had in it. And
oh my God! There's some really funny dark stuff here.
The thing
you killed the cinematographer. You can't eat the cinematographer.
This was so much fun to watch. The screenplay by Stephen Katz, it's so perfect in the way that it sets up. It tells us the backstage story of Nosferatu, the real Nosferatu, which it was Murnau's unauthorized adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula after Bram Stoker's widow declined to give him the rights to it. So he changed a few names around, changed enough of the story, and essentially made his own film. But it's essentially Dracula in its bare bones.
But let's continue where you were just going with that. Because in real life, okay, Bram Stoker's widow sued Murnau.
Yes.
she was supposed to, she got it, that all the copies were supposed to be destroyed.
Yep.
And thankfully that never happened, because you can still find Nosferatu on Amazon Prime as of tonight.
Yes. And
thank God for that.
Indeed. And it's funny because of the fact that, because not only do we continue to have Nosferatu, which is one of the greatest horror movies ever made and one of the greatest movies ever made, but we ended up with Shadow of the Vampire as well. And
yes.
It's funny because I hadn't actually seen Nosferatu when I saw Shadow of the Vampire. I hadn't seen it yet. A few months later, I did end up seeing it because I blind bought it on DVD, and I've been in love with it ever since.
Oh my God, the expressionistic. I mean, you look at Caligari, Cabinet of Caligari, and you look at Nosferatu, and you look at those German expressionist pictures, and the stuff they do with lighting and shadows. It's just, and the way they frame scenes, it's all just such beautiful stuff. It really is.
And the way, and the way that they allude to that in this movie as we are seeing filming of certain scenes, it's just absolutely wonderful. And it's just such, this is probably one of the most entertaining films about filmmaking ever made, and it's because of the fact that it decided, oh hey, we're gonna turn it on its ear. We're gonna turn this genre on its ear because we've got a perfect situation here where we can just make up the fact that the lead actor was actually a vampire. And that works because of the fact that the Count Orlok makeup is so distinctive. It's not like any other version of Dracula other than the Werner Herzog remake of Nosferatu. And because of the fact that he looks just so ugly and disgusting and grotesque on his own as Count Orlok, that gives you such flexibility to say, oh, well, maybe he was an actual vampire.
Well, here's the thing. I've read, I think I was in high school when I read. I have read Bram Stoker's Dracula. And Dracula is not this wonderful regal guy with a cape and pomade, you know?
Yeah.
He is very much a rat-like, disgusting, filthy, just animal, which is what Orlok is. And I've always appreciated, not only do I appreciate that for Orlok, but one of my favorite horror movies from the 70s, Tobe Hooper's version of Salem's Lot, basically made Count Barlow in the same mode as Nosferatu. So he looks just amazing in that film. You know, he had the two rat teeth at the front and the bald head and the pointy ears. Yeah. It's nightmare fuel is what it is. But let's talk about what really sold me on this film was an outstanding knockout performance from Willem Dafoe as Count Orlok, as Max Schreck.
Yeah, this is so. I in my review that I wrote for the film after rewatching it, like this movie is a dream for quote unquote go for broke actors, and you cannot imagine anybody else but John Malkovich playing Murnau and Willem Dafoe playing Shrek. Like almost.
Well, see, here's something interesting about John Malkovich. I read in an interview, and this has to be 20 years ago. John Malkovich said, "Hey, listen, it might have been around the time Con Air came out. I remember that." He said, "I read an interview where he said, I do every other movie. I do like a big blockbuster movie where I'm going to make a fortune." Because that means the movie after that I can make I don't need to make any money off it. I can make art house projects that I love, that I really want to invest in. So this is funny because I've never been crazy about I've never been crazy about Malkovich when he does accents, and he falls in and out of the German pretty frequently in this film. But I don't even make him suffer for that, because I think that this is one of those films where, hey, they probably did not have a fortune. They probably got Malkovich and Cary Elwes and Willem Dafoe on the cheap. And this is a passion project, and that comes through in every frame of it.
Yeah.
And I think that the fact that those guys are invested and they're not just going through the motions. I mean, you just watch Con Air, and you'll watch John Malkovich pick up his phone and phone in a performance. You know,
oh yeah,
it's not hard. But the thing is that when he's invested, and you could tell that. I mean, Willem Dafoe is absolutely creepy.
Yes.
He's great. Cary Elwes is just, I think he's the second cinematographer that comes in after they kill the first one.
Yes, he is.
And he's flying his plane, his biplane and all that. And Cary Elwes just has such a zest for things and a verve that it's just hysterical once he showed up. You want to talk about a stacked cast. This is a stacked cast, but a really great one. Who, like you said, going for broke here. And I think that this is, the first time I ever saw Eddie Izzard, so I didn't realize that Eddie Izzard was a comedian until I saw some of his primetime, his HBO specials. So this is a movie where you have a bunch of people who are sold on telling us the reality of this film and just going so deliciously over the top in some of the scenes that it's just a wonderment. And it's funny because, again, you want to talk about Sebastian in Hollow Man. Well, what person in the world is more powerful than a film director on his set, right?
Exactly. Yes.
And that's Murnau. And then you get this struggle between him and Orlok. Because it's funny, because Orlok becomes your typical Hollywood diva. I want this now. I want this now.
And that is what is so perfect about this movie is the fact that it takes this familiar premise. It takes this outrageous premise of, oh, hey, my lead actor is a vampire. And the lead actor is also, you're right, it transposes it into, he is a diva. He will only work at certain times of day. He will only work under these conditions. And they just have to go with it. And you have this match between him and Murnau, who's played by Malkovich, just absolutely perfect, where it's like, you get the impression that, like, Malkovich is probably channeling, like, every director he's ever worked with in some way, shape, or form.
And it's great, because Malkovich, the more this goes on, the more frustrated you see Murnau get.
Yeah.
To the point where they decide that they literally have to kill the vampire. But they're not just going to kill the vampire because he's a director. He has to catch it on film.
Yeah, exactly. And the ending of, oh my God, the finale of that movie is so wonderfully creepy because of the fact that it's like, it captures exactly what you just said as far as Murnau. He's completely uncompromising. And he just has to capture everything on film because it's all about the film. And it's all about his vision. And, it's not just Malkovich and Dafoe. You've got Eddie Izzard, who plays Gustav, who was Hooter in Nosferatu. You have Udo Kier, who's the producer, who's...
Oh, my God, I forgot about Udo Kier. You can't get any better than Udo Kier.
No. You have Cary Elwes as the cameraman, and the funny thing is, it's like you don't really think of Cary Elwes as being really. You don't really think of Cary Elwes as being in sort of the same vein of like a Malkovich or Willem Dafoe or even a Nicolas Cage, who was the producer of this movie, in terms of his ability to play broadly written characters. But really, if you think about it, that's what he does as best. Like, you think about Wesley in Princess Bride, you think about his Robin Hood and Mel Brooks film, you think about him in this, it's like he's really excelling at playing this character that he can just go just a bit over the top and still like ground it in a degree of absurdity. And the lead actress in this movie is Catherine McCormick, who is best known for Braveheart, and she plays the lead actress in Nosferatu, and even she has fun with the role. She's got a couple of scenes where she's really funny.
I think that doesn't she get really high once? She gets really she gets knocked out on drugs at one point, right? I think.
Yeah.
If I'm remembering this correctly.
Yeah, I think so.
And Murnau's pissed off because now he's got a vampire diva for a main actor. his main lead actress is so high she's not going to be able to film the scenes. But I think that going back to what you were saying about Cary Elwes, I think that one of the things that he's never gotten enough credit for his career is his comic instincts are amazing. He's just so funny when he has hooks into the right role. And those roles you mentioned, like Wesley or Robin Hood Men in Tights, I mean, those movies wouldn't be those movies without him.
No,
you know?
No, and that's one of those that's one of the things that's so wonderful about a movie like this, rediscovering a movie like this, and it's unfortunate that it's not really available anywhere. It's a shame because I think people would really, I think people would really enjoy rewatching this movie and rediscovering this movie, and and a big part of it is, and one of the reasons this movie is so successful was not just a filmmaking comedy, really is where the comedy comes from, but a genuine horror film is the fact that they nail recreating the attention to detail as far as silent film filmmaking, and just the atmosphere that the original Nosferatu has, and bringing that to this story.
Plus, let's give credit to, I don't know who the makeup artist was, but the special effects makeup that they do on Dafoe to make him look like Nosferatu is amazing stuff.
Yes.
It's really next level stuff. Like, they captured the look of the original Max Schreck almost to a T. Yeah. And for him to be able to, I think that's one of those deals where they always say it's hard for actors with makeup because you're hiding your face. But I think he works perfectly through that makeup and makes it a part of who he is, which is really what you need to do when you're behind makeup like that. Mm-hmm. And it's just I can't say enough good stuff about it. I mean, I saw it in the theater. Actually, I didn't see Final Destination until later, but I saw The Cell, and I saw Hollow Man, and I saw Shadows of the Vampire. 3 of the 4 movies we're talking about, I saw in the theaters back in the day, 20 years ago. So that probably adds to my experience. But I remember walking out of the theater after this was over, and I turned to my friend X, and I'm like, this is that was amazing. I can't say enough good things about it. And 20 years later, I feel exactly the same way.
Yeah. No, and it's one of those things where it's like and it's funny, I just watched for the first time a horror movie that came out a couple of years ago. It's currently on Shudder, and it basically grafts the film about filmmaking structure to a found footage movie, and it does it really successfully. And it's called Found Footage 3D. It's really entertaining if you want to check it out. And it's like, that is funny to think of just how flexible that premise is of making a film, of making a film about making a film, and how flexible it can be if you have the right premise and if you have the right execution. And this one really does, because of the fact that it's like, it'd be interesting. Like, this is arguably as unique and entertaining as Ed Wood is. And it's
absolutely.
But the thing is, what makes Ed Wood fun is the fact that it's like all of those filmmakers are terrible. What makes this fun is that they're making a great movie, but the situation is terrible. Because Murnau decided, I'm going to go completely realistic. I'm going to hire an actual vampire to play my vampire. And that's one of the reasons that this movie is just so wonderful.
Well, I mean, you hire a method actor, you have to appreciate the method, right?
Yep. Yeah, and that's why one of the things I thought about was like, you really could not get anybody else other than Malkovich or Dafoe for those respective roles. I mean, even like, and the thing is, it's almost disappointing that Nicolas Cage couldn't find a role for himself in this movie, because I feel like he would have just added to the madness in a way that would have just made this film even more delightful.
Now, speaking of vampire films and Nicolas Cage, have you ever seen Vampire's Kiss?
I've not.
Okay. You owe it to yourself to see Vampire's Kiss. Everything that people think of Nicolas Cage about being an off-the-wall whack job now, yeah, you're going to love every ounce of that.
Oh, I definitely will plan on watching it. Well, thank you very much, Phil, for joining me tonight.
Hey, listen, Brian, I am always happy when you call upon me to expound on the movies that are not very good, and even once in a while we get to a good one.
I'd like to thank Phil for joining me tonight on the Song Cinema podcast. It's always fun to talk horror with him, even if the movies are not that great. You can check out other episodes that we've done, some of which we checked during the podcast during the episode, including the Rage, Carry 2, and End of Days from my Class of 1999 series. That's it for this episode of the Song Cinema podcast. There's hopefully going to be a few more episodes out by the end of the year. And this year is going to continue to be an interesting one from a film standpoint, because of the fact that there are a lot of different things going on as far as release schedules, but it's going to be a full year to talk about it in general. Between the film festivals I've seen, the screeners I've seen, just movies in general, I've seen over 300 movies for this year, and it's going to be fun to see how this all wraps up. Thank you for joining me at the Song Cinema podcast. Subscribe to us on YouTube. If you could, subscribe to the Patreon at patreon.com/songcinema. And that's it for me. Thank you very much. This is Brian Scuttle, and thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com.